To my left is the grave of Dic Penderyn, or Richard Lewis. It's more of a recent tombstone that was put there, but he was executed for the role that he played in Merthyr Tydfil, or Merthyr Rising, in 1831. Dic Penderyn was a supposed ringleader of this movement, although there's some question as to the role that he played in it, because it later came out that they just really wanted to use him as a figurehead to execute and make a statement that they wouldn't tolerate this, you know, the aristocratic class in England. And this was during the Industrial Revolution. All these people came from their rural farming communities and their rural fishing communities in Wales and Cornwall, and especially the backcountry parts of England and Wales, seeking a new form of life that the capitalist economic system claimed it could provide, seeking a new way of life that supposedly the Industrial Revolution would give. And they weren't finding it. In communities like Merthyr Tydfil, they worked for company heads that would consistently charge them for living on company property more than they earned, and they couldn't leave because they were in debt, and the police would come after them and put them in a debtor's colony like Australia. They were constantly only paid in company money. They couldn't spend it outside of the company town. They were basically living and dying in these mines. And it reached a point where there was a court hearing held by company men. Basically, the company had their own kind of court system, and they were calling people into the local pubs saying, you owe us this, 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 and this, so you're going to be working for us for 15 years to pay it off, and by the time that 15 years was up, they would owe them 10 other things. And so that you would have to basically slave away until you died in these coal mines. And a group of men gathered together and slaughtered a sheep and dipped a white flag in the sheep's blood. This was the first time a red flag was ever used as an explicitly political symbol, and it became a revolutionary symbol. And this was a time of the Chartists, which were calling for work reform, for universal suffrage, for the ability of every man to vote, and every woman to vote as well. Very forward, progressive message. And there was a time in England where this could have very easily turned into essentially a communist or a socialist state, much more socialist than what we have today. And a situation arose where they basically forced all of the company men into a small hotel in town, and they had to call in the army. It was some units of the military, and essentially these miners managed to go hold a sit-in, and the military was basically being called in to beat them into working again. But the sit-in succeeded, and all of these miners finally rose up and basically pushed the military off, and for a period of several months you had basically an independent socialist proto-state in Wales. You had all these miners coming from surrounding towns, waving their red flag and having these cordoned off zones. But it culminated in a final event whereby a group of miners charged at the military men, because the military were leveling their bayonets with orders to shoot at this mob. And the men had no intention of harming the military, but when the bayonets were charging, when the military men were charging, somebody pushed one of them, and he fell into his bayonet. Now, it didn't hurt him, but it disabled him. It brought him to the ground, and he could have easily been killed by the mob. And initially there were two people that the courts were going to execute, but it was only when this military man started begging them not to kill the one man, begging him not to kill him, because he literally he was an elder, he pulled this military man away and told the crowd, don't harm him, he's just an average Joe like you or me, and the crowd decided to back off. But this elderly man's son was Dic Penderyn, and they convicted Dic Penderyn and executed him, and thousands of people showed up to his funeral. And basically the only people that were against it were the upper class, and even many people in the upper class were saying, please don't do this. Many people in Parliament were saying, why are you going to kill this man? But the aristocratic class knew that they had to do this so that their industrial revolution could keep pressing forward. And eventually Dic Penderyn was forgotten, but I believe in the 1870s, decades later, somebody came forward in America and said, I am Dic Penderyn. I escaped and my friend took the fall for me. So there's this legend of Dic Penderyn that's continuing. And even today, the grave was recreated, reset up by labor unions in the 1970s. And the one behind me is even more recent, I believe, because it got knocked over. But this is a monument to a socialist revolution that happened in Wales in the 1830s, before the Communist Manifesto was ever written. And it was upon actions like this, upon the Industrial Revolution, that Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin, they started formulating their theories about the Industrial Revolution. They started looking at the workers in Liverpool and Brighton and Manchester and here in Wales, and how their life and standard of living was going down, and yet the standard of living of the company bosses was going way up. He owned a castle that had been made by his own workers, and yet the workers were toiling away for the promise of this, utopia that never came, or only came for one or two people at the expense of thousands and thousands of others. And I think that modern England, whether it admits it or not, is built on the legacy of men like Dic Penderyn behind me. And I think that it's important that we remember everything he stood for, and people who, hold his memory still stand for.